Hello and welcome. I'm Ashwin Ahmad and I'm in conversation with Ranjan Mathai, former ambassador to the United Kingdom. And we are going to be talking about Britain post-Brexit. Ambassador, welcome to our show, first for a start. And I want to ask you now, Britain has formally left on the 31st of January, but it's been a kind of, bittersweet parting. Could Boris Johnson have handled it a little more sensitively? And number two, how do you see Britain and the EU going from here?
Well, it's not a story of Boris Johnson handling it himself. There have been 3 prime ministers who have ventured into this field. And the question is, perhaps he could have done things differently, but would the EU partner have gone along with a different way of doing it? So I think that's really a question which doesn't take us anywhere. The deal has been done, and I think now what both sides have to do is to make sure, and I think their minds are focused on this, on making sure that these negotiations which lead to the final parting are handled in a way which leaves both sides with the constructive sense that we have done the best.
Right.
It has not been a great event, having after, 40 years, more than 40 years, broken apart. But make the best of it now and see how to build on the relationship for the future.
Ambassador, I also want to ask you now, Boris has a lot of problems at home. He has to face, increasing calls for independence from Scotland. His good friend, the Irish Prime Minister, is facing, possibilities that he may not be re-elected. There raises questions of the fact that, the rise of Sinn Féin may lead to the troubles again with the backstop agreement. And so how does he reconcile these troubles at home and negotiate a trade deal at the same time? He only has 1 year.
Yes, the trade deal involves a huge amount of intricate detail, so it's not going to be easy. But he seems very determined to get it done. And I think if the will is there, at least the major substance can be done, even if not all the documents are in place. You can have some broad principles agreed and then flesh them out over a period of time. But it's doable, but it's not going to be easy. The internal questions are, of course, a little more hypothetical, and right now, Mr. Johnson hasn't really addressed the question. He hasn't really been challenged on this. He's only, I believe, already said that he doesn't want another referendum on Scotland now. The question is, what will happen if these come up again and again? As I said, this is a bit hypothetical for now. The real one is in Ireland, because as you said, there's an election which has taken place. And the negotiations, how they proceed on the critical question of the customs arrangement between the EU and the UK. Will it be in the Irish Sea, a notional line, or will there be again a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland? These are very, very critical questions. And the fact that Mr. Varadkar is now not in the same position he was earlier may complicate issues. But I don't see that yet.
Right.
We will need to see what is the position of the new government of Ireland. As far as the UK is concerned, they're very clear. Northern Ireland is and will remain part of the United Kingdom. And the line to be drawn between the EU and the United Kingdom will be drawn in the manner which causes the least amount of problems in terms of the Good Friday Agreement and the subsequent peace on that island.
I now want to come to the question of Europe. I mean, with Britain exiting from Europe, how strong do you see the European body? It's been talked about that, Europe as a counterweight perhaps to the United States may no longer have the same effect as it would with the exit of Britain. How do you see Europe proceeding from here?
I think Europe still has a very great potential to develop as I don't know if counterweight to the US is the right expression, but an independent pole in world politics. But the question is, has the European Union pulled its act together in terms of sorting out these kind of pulls and pressures which are coming from many nations. I think Britain was only the most extreme example. We have had similar problems in Italy. We have had pressures coming from within France, of all countries. You had a major political party there which challenged the European Union. So there have been pulls and pressures, and I think the key question is, how will the Franco-German motor operate in the years immediately ahead? Essentially, it is this motor which has kept the European Union ticking, you might say. And if these two countries are able to work out a way forward for the Union as a whole, then I think it has a future. But for that, I think much depends on Germany, even more than France right now, because the French position is a little more clear. What we need to see is what happens in Germany next year.
Yes, that was going to be my follow-up question to you. I mean, Merkel is retiring. Macron is beset with domestic problems. How do you see who will, bring this bloc together? Because Angela Merkel was crucial in bringing the EU together. Do you see someone stepping in and taking that role?
Well, it's too early to say that in terms of German politics. But I think having come so far, the broad consensus in both France and Germany is that they have to give it their best shot to see that this union persists, survives, not only survives, grows and expands its influence in the world. But there are many real world, real life problems for both leadership in Germany and in France. I personally think that they will be able to get out of them, but it's not going to be easy. And it's not going to be a short-term success.
Right.
I believe it will take a certain amount of time, effort, and there will be ups and downs. But in the end of the day, I think France and Germany can do this together.
I now want to come to India. Now that Britain has exited the European, of course, it's still there for this 1 year, but we could technically call this, a limbo period. How do you think India will view the UK now? Because number one, there could be a possibility that, Indian businesses in the UK will relocate to Europe. Do you think that the India-UK relationship will perhaps be not diminished, but, it'll cool down for the next post-Brexit?
No. I think the India-UK relationship stands almost on its own. We had a very, very strong relationship with the UK for historical reasons, even before it joined the EU. And I think most of the reasons why we have a strong relationship with the UK are independent of the fact that it is a member of the EU. Right. So I don't see that happening. I see, in fact, if anything, the relationship getting stronger. Because particularly from the UK side, for Britain, building up partnerships with key world centers, key world powers, among whom they certainly do add India, will be of great importance. And once they have got over their negotiations, I think they will work closely with India. I don't see that as a problem. In fact, you mentioned the relocation of Indian business. Right now, Indian business has more investments in the UK than in the rest of the EU put together.
Yes.
I think most of them will wait and see whether their business in the EU as a whole gets impacted, and that depends on the outcome of the negotiations between Britain and the EU. So I don't see them relocating now. If they get, broadly speaking, a reasonable deal, even if there is some added cost, for many reasons, Indian business would prefer to stay in Britain than go to the continent of Europe, language being the most simple one, but also certain ways of doing business, and you've got acclimatized to living in Britain, working there and operating from there. I don't see them relocating that easily.
One thing India that will be very concerned about is the rise of extremism in Britain. We've seen an increase in the protests by separatist groups in Kashmir. We've seen the rise of Khalistani groups, and which becomes even more significant with the opening of the Kartarpur corridor. So how do you think Britain will work together on these concerns? How do you think Boris Johnson will react? And number two, Boris Johnson now wants to reach out with Brexit. How much is on the agenda of a free trade agreement, and what can we expect by that?
I think Boris Johnson will definitely reach out to India. He has already identified, he meaning he and his government, India as a potentially very important trade partner, and therefore they would want to reach out to us quickly. Remember also that the City of London has ambitions to remain one of the world's preeminent global financial centers, and they would take a lot of interest in what is happening in India. So I think these two forces will keep Britain very closely engaged. The domestic issues which you referred to, these are quite serious. But we have had a tradition in the UK of protests ongoing even with the most friendly countries.
Right.
The question is, when these protests go beyond a point, what will the government do? Much would depend on the strength of the reaction from Delhi, drawing a line saying if this carries on, it will begin to impact our relationship.
Right.
I think if that happens, yes, I think the Brits will have to do something about it. But I don't see protests dying down, and I don't see them being stopped entirely. That is a fact of life in Britain.
I also want to draw your attention, the active rise of the Indian diaspora. I mean, once Jeremy Corbyn made those statements on Kashmir, we saw a lot of the Indian diaspora, and we really haven't seen that before. Coming out and campaigning, I think, in crucial seats against the Labour Party. How do you see the evolvement of the Indian diaspora? Is it linked to our Prime Minister, or are there other factors? And how much of a role could they play, in determining key issues?
I think the Indian diaspora, the Indian population in the UK, have traditionally been Labour voters. The first Prime Minister to make the quote-unquote Indian vote a priority was actually David Cameron. And I recall having actually talked to him and his party people.
Right.
And they took great pride in the fact that they were able to take something from 5% to close to 17 to 20% of the Indian vote. I think in the last round, probably it's gone up even higher. And a large number of very able young Indians have joined the Conservative Party and got into Parliament. And 2 or 3 of them have been rewarded with very, very important ministerships. So I think this is a trend which is ongoing, irrespective of the current government in India. But certainly, some of the protests we saw and the way in which the extremist elements began to badmouth India caused a further drift away from the Labour Party, particularly after their ill-thought-out resolution on Kashmir. So I think that is a trend that will continue. You must also note that the Indian diaspora, particularly in certain key cities, represents a reasonably successful community, a reasonably prosperous community for whom the Conservative Party's values today have more resonance than some of the things the Labour Party stands for. So it's a trend within the British reality also. So I think this is going to be, we are going to see more of this.
You see an active part in, key issues, say Kashmir, etc. They're going to get more vocal about this?
Well, they will get vocal. But what I was trying to say was that the Indian diaspora will now begin to reflect the complete diversity of Britain.
Right.
We have had Indians, South Asians, even in the UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party. We have had Indians in the extreme left. We have had Indians in conservatives.
Right.
So I think this will carry on. We will see a lot of the extremist activity because, quite frankly, this is funded by Pakistan, and the Pakistani intelligence services are very active in supporting the Khalistanis and keeping the Kashmiri movement alive. They have one advantage. in that because of the dual nationality which is allowed to Pakistani nationals, you have a lot of really nasty elements who are able to collaborate directly with Pakistan, and you have politicians who come who have citizenship in Britain. There are politicians in both Pakistan and in Britain, apparently. So this will continue. But as I said, within the overall framework of India-UK relations, I think the British will make sure that this is not allowed to impact it too negatively.
I now want to come to Europe itself. We had at the Raisina dialogue, for instance, our external affairs minister talked about, that the India-EU relationship, we had not fulfilled its potential. And this was echoed by some EU MEPs as well. So when Prime Minister Modi will be going to Brussels, what do you expect to see, given that there is an interest from both sides to, push ties further?
Well, the very first thing I think is we have to ask why we haven't been able to push the India-EU broad-based trade and investment agreement, or FTA as you want to call it. And there's been a failure on both sides. I think we have to overcome that. The EU is still a very important source of finance, of technology, it is one of the world's great trading powers. So building a relationship with that center is very important for India. Conversely, if the EU is to have greater trade, greater influence in the world, it will have to work with the rising India. And I think this is the time when we need to look back and say we failed and we need to do things differently, and we need to act quickly now to get a trade agreement on the anvil. Certainly we must do more to attract EU investments into India. And the EU would, I think, be keen to see that as Indian business becomes a global presence, instead of only in the UK, they do invest greater amounts on continental Europe in some of the key areas where they have been investing. Mm-hmm. The relationship in technology is very important for both of us, I think. And the students, the number of Indian students going to the EU could certainly be increased. There's a huge knowledge-based industry which could develop in both our countries, and we could collaborate in this sphere. So I think there is a requirement, particularly in Brussels and in Delhi, to look more intensively at what went wrong so far and what we could do better.
I want to draw your attention now to the CAA resolution that was passed within the EU. Do you think that, there is perhaps a divide within the EU between left and right-wing politicians, number one? And do you think there is, our diplomacy was able to counter the Pakistani lobby in this regard? How do you view the CAA resolution that was passed? That was put forward.
It was put forward, but I think the European Parliament has in fact decided not to work on it for a while. I've dealt with the European Parliament in the early 90s when a very large number of issues we used to face a lot of flack from parliamentarians. Apart from Kashmir, there was a lobby which was very active on Punjab issues. There was another lobby which was very active on green issues. There was a lobby which was against the Narmada Dam. And in each case, you had to go and fight your case. At the end of the day, the European Parliament is not able to, even its resolutions are not going to really make a real difference to how the EU and India function together. It makes for bad optics and it makes for bad atmosphere. But I think Indian diplomacy can manage it. It's a question of how active you are. Right. Certainly, you have to take it for granted that the lobbies working against you will be funded by the Pakistanis, will be actively aided by them, and they will get resonance as long as media articles are continuing to come out which are negative. So there's an activity which is across the board. It is not just diplomacy, it's working with the media, it's working with political parties, and it's working to explain your case in a more effective manner.
And finally, if I could just ask you, Where do you see the relationship? I mean, when you talk about building ties, where can India and the EU push things forward? Perhaps, with our strategic interests in the Indian Ocean, etc., our concerns that we have with Pakistan, etc. So how do we work with them on that? And how can possibly we have a role with Britain as well?
Well, with Britain, I think it could be it's easier for me to get there. Britain doesn't have as large a role in the Indian Ocean as France does, but Britain is not giving up on the hope of being still globally influential. It is a member of the P5, it is a member of the G20, it's a member of, the Commonwealth ties us together. We have intelligence, military and other relationships which are very, very important. I think also the British defense industry is of great significance to India, and I have heard that even on the development of a jet engine, which is a very, very key strategic project for India, the British technology partners would be a little more forthcoming than they have in the past. So I think there's a lot that can be done there. And as I said, finance is one area where Britain will be influential and will continue to be influential for India, and we need to build on that. As far as the EU is concerned, we need to see what way their external action now proceeds.
Right.
As I said, with France, we have built a very strong relationship which relates to the Indian Ocean. The EU as a whole has taken a great deal of interest in Central Asia and in the whole connectivity project. They have had a lot of questions over the BRI. And I think this is an area where we could work together. What is actually the Chinese aim in this BRI project, and are there elements in it which both Europe and India need not find very comfortable, to be polite? And if so, what are we going to do about it? Secondly, in the area between Europe and India, we have this huge West Asian region, or Middle East as you call it.
Right.
What is the joint interest in countering radicalism?
Yes.
What is the joint interest in making sure that energy flows continue without difficulty? I think these are some of the kind of areas where we will be able to build a dialogue with the European Union. We need to see the European Union a little more active on all these fronts and taking forward its dialogue with India. I think this visit by the Prime Minister and the summit is an opportunity for the European Union to be more relevant. And it is an opportunity for India to make our case more clearly that this is an area we expect the European Union to be more of a partner for India.
Ambassador Mathai, thank you so much for your views. I'm Ashwin Ahmad. Thank you for watching.